Deep within the bayous of southern Louisiana, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds and the Mississippi Delta conceals its darkest secrets, lies a tale so disturbing that local historians have spent over a century trying to erase it from official records. In 1863, as Confederate cannons thundered across distant battlefields, something far more sinister than war was unfolding at Belmont Plantation. 73 enslaved souls vanished without a trace in a single night. 17 family members died under mysterious circumstances within 6 months. And at the center of it all, a marriage ceremony so forbidden that witnesses were sworn to secrecy under threat of death. The union between 67-year-old Cornelius Thibodeau and his 16-year-old granddaughter, Celeste Marie Thibodeau. What you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse basements, sealed away in private family vaults, and whispered about only in the darkest corners of Louisiana's Creole society. Before we continue with the story of the cursed bloodline of Belmont, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from tonight. The records that survived the mysterious fire of 1889 at the Vermilion Parish Courthouse tell only fragments of this nightmare. But those fragments paint a picture of generational madness, calculated murder, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Louisiana's plantation aristocracy. Belmont Plantation sprawled across 8,000 acres of prime Louisiana sugarcane land, its Gothic revival mansion rising from the humid earth like a monument to antebellum excess. Built in 1834 by Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, a French immigrant who had made his fortune in the sugar trade, the estate represented everything the Old South aspired to be. Wealthy, powerful, and utterly merciless in its pursuit of profit. By 1863, the third year of the Civil War, Belmont had become a shadow of its former glory. Federal blockades had strangled the sugar trade, Confederate currency had become worthless paper, and Union forces were advancing steadily through Louisiana. The plantation's master, Cornelius Thibodeau, had inherited not just vast wealth, but also the strange customs and obsessions of his Franco-Louisiana heritage. Cornelius was a man of imposing stature, standing well over 6 feet tall with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look right through a person's soul. His face, weathered by decades of Louisiana sun and marked by a distinctive scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a memento from a duel in his youth, commanded both respect and fear from everyone who encountered him. He dressed always in black, a habit that had earned him the nickname Le Corbeau, the Raven, among the plantation's enslaved population. The Thibodeau family had always been different from other plantation dynasties. While their neighbors built their fortunes through conventional means, the Thibodeau clan maintained secretive connections to the remnants of Louisiana's colonial French aristocracy and practiced traditions that predated even the founding of New Orleans. They belonged to a clandestine society known as Les Gardiens du Sang Pur, the Guardians of Pure Blood, an organization that traced its roots back to medieval France and maintained that certain bloodlines possessed qualities that must be preserved at any cost. This society, operating in complete secrecy throughout Louisiana's Creole parishes, believed that strategic intermarriage within specific family lines would preserve not just wealth and social position, but something far more mystical, what they called la force ancestrale, the ancestral force. Members carried ornate silver medallions bearing a twisted family tree symbol, and they gathered monthly at locations known only to the initiated. Cornelius had been widowed for 7 years, his wife Evangeline having died in 1856 under circumstances that the family physician had diplomatically recorded as consumption, though household servants whispered of strange marks on her neck and arms that suggested a more violent end. Their son, Henri Thibodeau, had married a beautiful young woman named Isabelle Landry in 1845, and the couple had produced one child, Celeste Marie, born in 1847. Tragedy had seemed to follow the Thibodeau bloodline like a hunting dog. Henri and Isabelle had perished in a carriage accident in 1863, just as the Union Army was tightening its grip on Louisiana. The official report stated that their horses had been spooked by artillery fire from a nearby skirmish, sending their carriage plunging into a bayou where both parents drowned. But several witnesses reported hearing the crash occur hours before any military action had taken place in that area, and the carriage was found with its axle deliberately damaged, marks that suggested sabotage rather than accident. This left 16-year-old Celeste Marie as the sole heir to the Thibodeau fortune, making her one of the wealthiest young women in war-torn Louisiana. She was, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful, with the classical features prized by Creole society: olive-toned skin, dark hair that fell in natural ringlets to her waist, and startling green eyes that seemed to change color in different light. But more than her beauty, Celeste possessed an intelligence that made adults uncomfortable. She spoke fluent French, Spanish and English, had received an education that rivaled that of most men, and displayed an unsettling ability to see through the lies and pretenses of the adults around her. The plantation itself harbored dark secrets that went far beyond the typical brutalities of slavery. The slave quarters at Belmont were arranged in an unusual pattern, not the typical parallel rows found on most plantations, but in a complex geometric design that formed what looked from above like an enormous ritual circle. The enslaved population lived in constant fear, not just of their master's whip, but of something far more sinister. Local folklore spoke of the Belmont disappearances, enslaved individuals who would vanish without explanation, their absence explained away as runaways or deaths from disease. But the truth was far more disturbing. Deep in the plantation's most remote sections, hidden beneath a grove of ancient live oak trees draped in Spanish moss, lay a cemetery that appeared on no official maps. Here, crude wooden markers bore no names, only numbers carved deep into weathered wood. By 1863, those numbered graves had reached well beyond 300. On the morning of September 15, 1863, as autumn mist rose from the bayous and Confederate deserters moved like ghosts through the Louisiana wilderness, Cornelius Thibodeau made an announcement that would shock even the hardened residents of the plantation district. He intended to marry his granddaughter, Celeste Marie, in a ceremony to be held within the month. The announcement came during what should have been a routine meeting with his overseer, Etienne Boudreau, a brutal man whose methods had earned him a reputation for cruelty, even by the standards of antebellum Louisiana. Boudreau, a lean figure with calculating eyes and hands permanently stained with tobacco juice, had been reviewing the plantation's increasingly desperate financial situation when Cornelius interrupted him with words that made the hardened overseer's face go pale. "The solution to our troubles lies not in selling land or reducing operations," Cornelius said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had never been contradicted. "It lies in an ancient provision of our family charter, one that my grandfather wisely included when he established the plantation's legal framework." He produced from his desk a leather-bound document case, its brass fittings green with age and its surface scarred by decades of handling. From within, he withdrew a collection of papers written in archaic French legal terminology, the ink faded to brown but still legible. As he read aloud, his voice took on an almost ritualistic cadence. According to the founding charter of Belmont Plantation, established by royal grant in 1834, all lands, properties, and holdings shall remain within the direct bloodline of the Thibodeau family in perpetuity. Should circumstances arise that threaten the continuation of this bloodline, emergency provisions may be enacted to preserve the ancestral inheritance. His finger traced the elaborate script as he continued. These provisions include the right of the patriarch to enter into union with any direct female descendant for the sole purpose of maintaining familial control over all properties and assets. Boudreau stared at his employer in stunned silence. Even in Louisiana, where Creole families had long practiced strategic intermarriage to preserve fortunes, what Cornelius was describing went far beyond social convention. It was not merely unusual. It was an abomination that violated both law and nature. "Sir," Boudreau finally managed, "you cannot be serious. The girl is your granddaughter. Such a union, Cornelius interrupted, would be perfectly legal under the emergency provisions of our charter. More importantly, it would ensure that Belmont remains under Thibodeau control as God and our ancestors intended." The overseer's objections died in his throat as he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Around Cornelius's neck, barely visible beneath his white collar, hung a silver medallion that Boudreau had seen before, worn by other plantation owners who belonged to Louisiana's most secretive and powerful societies. The medallion bore the symbol of a twisted family tree, its branches intertwining in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the plantation and lightning flickered across the sky like cannon fire, Cornelius summoned Celeste to his study. The room was a shrine to the Thibodeau family legacy. Oil paintings of stern ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow anyone who dared enter. Leather-bound ledgers containing records of sugar harvests, slave purchases, and financial transactions filled tall bookcases, while the massive mahogany desk displayed artifacts from the family's French origins. An ornate letter opener that had belonged to Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, a crystal inkwell gifted by a Louisiana governor, and a collection of documents sealed with red wax and ribbon. Celeste entered the room with the graceful composure that had been drilled into her since childhood, but her green eyes showed a wariness that had not been there before her parents' death. She had grown increasingly suspicious of her grandfather's explanations for the various tragedies that seemed to follow their family, and something in his recent behavior had set off every instinct for self-preservation that she possessed. "Sit down, my dear," Cornelius said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from his desk. The arrangement forced her to sit with her back to the room's only door, a detail that did not escape her notice. "We must discuss your future, and the future of everything your family has built." As thunder rolled across the plantation grounds, Cornelius began to outline his plan with the methodical precision of a man who had spent months preparing his arguments. He spoke of family duty, of ancestral obligations, of the sacred trust that had been placed in their bloodline. His voice carried a hypnotic quality that seemed designed to lull listeners into acceptance. But Celeste found herself focusing not on his words, but on the subtle details that revealed his true nature. The way his fingers drummed against the desk in patterns that matched the twisted tree symbol on his medallion. The manner in which his eyes never quite met hers directly, and most disturbing of the barely perceptible smile that played at the corners of his mouth as he spoke of her parents' recent death. "The marriage will take place on October 13th, he concluded, as if announcing the date of a business transaction. "The ceremony will be private, attended only by those who understand the sacred nature of what we are preserving. You will, of course, consent to this arrangement." It was not a request. It was a command, delivered with the absolute authority of a man who had never been denied anything he desired. But as Celeste looked into her grandfather's eyes, she saw something that chilled her more than his words ever could. The cold calculation of a predator who had found his perfect prey. The weeks following Cornelius's announcement transformed Belmont Plantation into something resembling a fortress under siege. Word of the planned marriage had somehow leaked beyond the plantation's boundaries, despite the family's attempts at secrecy, and the reaction from Louisiana's Creole society had been swift and decisive. Several neighboring plantation families, including the influential Boudoir and Narcisse clans, had sent carefully worded letters expressing their concern about the arrangement. Even in a society accustomed to strategic marriages between distant relatives, what Cornelius proposed crossed lines that had never been crossed before. But the most disturbing responses came from members of Les Gardiens du Sang Pur themselves. 3 separate midnight visits brought representatives of the secret society to Belmont's doors, each bearing the silver medallion that granted them access to Cornelius's private study. These meetings, conducted in hushed French and ending always with the visitors departing before dawn, left the plantation's master increasingly agitated and unpredictable. Celeste, meanwhile, had begun her own investigation into the family's true history. Using skills learned from years of managing household accounts and correspondence, she started piecing together information from documents, overheard conversations, and careful observations of her grandfather's behavior. What she discovered painted a picture that was far more horrifying than even her worst suspicions had suggested. Her parents' death, she realized, had been no accident. Hidden among her father's papers, she found evidence of a heated argument between Henri and Cornelius just days before the carriage crash. Henri had discovered something about the family's finances, specifically evidence that Cornelius had been systematically embezzling from plantation accounts and selling enslaved families to cover gambling debts and society obligations. More damaging still, Henri had learned about his father's involvement with Les Gardiens du Sang Pur and threatened to expose their activities to federal authorities. The argument had culminated in Henri's decision to remove Celeste from Belmont permanently, taking her to live with relatives in New Orleans until the war ended and they could relocate to somewhere beyond Cornelius's reach. But the carriage carrying them away from the plantation had never reached its destination. Even more disturbing was what Celeste discovered about the plantation's hidden cemetery. Using maps found in her father's effects, She was able to locate the burial ground and conduct her own investigation. What she found there defied comprehension. The numbered graves didn't represent decades of deaths. They represented a systematic program of elimination that had been ongoing since the plantation's founding. The buried individuals weren't just enslaved people who had died from disease or overwork. They were people who had learned too much about the Thibodeau family's activities or posed threats to their secrets. Many of the graves were far too small to contain adult bodies. Some were so recent that the earth above them had not yet settled. And most chilling of all, several graves bore dates from after her parents' death, suggesting that Cornelius had been preparing for potential opposition to his plans by permanently silencing anyone who might interfere. As October approached and the forced marriage loomed closer, Celeste began to understand the true scope of her grandfather's madness. This wasn't just about preserving family wealth or maintaining social position. Les gardiens du sang pur had convinced themselves that certain bloodlines possessed mystical properties that could only be preserved through the most extreme measures. Cornelius genuinely believed that marrying his granddaughter would grant him some form of power over life and death itself. The society's members, scattered throughout Louisiana's plantation elite, had been conducting similar experiments for generations. They justified their actions through a twisted interpretation of French aristocratic traditions, claiming that royal bloodlines had maintained their power through strategic inbreeding, and that the same principles applied to their colonial descendants. But what they were really doing was using these beliefs as justification for acts of unspeakable cruelty and depravity. Celeste's research revealed that several other plantation families had attempted similar unions over the years, always with disastrous results. Children born from these relationships suffered from physical and mental deformities that the society interpreted as purification of the bloodline, rather than the genetic damage they actually represented. Those children who survived to adulthood often displayed the same violent tendencies and complete lack of empathy that characterized their parents. Most terrifying of all was her discovery of her grandfather's true plans for their union. Hidden in coded documents that she managed to decipher, she found evidence that Cornelius intended to murder her immediately after their wedding night. Once any potential pregnancy had been established, he had convinced himself that her death would complete some sort of ritual transformation that would grant him extended life and absolute power over the plantation and its inhabitants. On October 10th, just 3 days before the scheduled ceremony, Celeste made a decision that would seal the fate of everyone at Belmont Plantation. She would not be a passive victim of her grandfather's madness. If she was going to die, she would take as many of Les Gardiens du Sang Pur with her as possible. But first, she needed to ensure that their crimes would not be forgotten or covered up, as so many others had been. She began writing detailed letters describing everything she had learned about the society, the hidden cemetery, and her grandfather's plans. These letters, addressed to newspaper editors in New Orleans, federal authorities, and prominent religious leaders, would be her insurance policy. But she also began preparing for a more immediate form of justice. In the plantation's extensive herb garden, maintained by elderly enslaved women who possessed knowledge passed down through generations, Celeste began collecting ingredients for a compound that would serve her purposes perfectly. The plants she harvested, foxglove, nightshade, oleander, and others, were commonly used in folk medicine, but became deadly poisons when prepared by someone with sufficient knowledge of their properties. As the wedding preparations continued around her, Celeste smiled and played the role of the obedient granddaughter, while carefully planning the destruction of everyone who had participated in her family's reign of terror. The morning of October 13th, 1863, dawned with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of everyone at Belmont Plantation. Spanish moss hung motionless from the ancient oak trees, as if the very air had become too heavy to stir, and the usual sounds of plantation life, birds singing, insects buzzing, workers calling to one another, were eerily absent. Even the animals seemed to sense that something unnatural was about to occur. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the grounds, members of Les Gardiens du Sang Pur began arriving for the ceremony. They came not in carriages or on horseback, which might have attracted attention from Union patrols or curious neighbors, but by more secretive means, arriving at night and hiding in the plantation's outbuildings until the appointed time. Each man wore the distinctive silver medallion that marked him as a guardian of the pure blood. and each carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed himself above both human law and divine judgment. Among the attendees was Dr. Alphonse Hébert, a physician whose practice in New Orleans had earned him a reputation for discretion in matters that other doctors would not touch. Hébert's presence served multiple purposes. He would officiate at the ceremony using authority granted to him by the society, and he would be available to handle any medical complications that might arise. His black medical bag, never far from his side, contained instruments that had been used for purposes far removed from healing. Also present was Judge Armand Fontenot, whose position in Louisiana's legal system allowed him to create official documents that could legitimize even the most questionable transactions. Fontenot had spent his career ensuring that society members faced no legal consequences for their actions, and his expertise in manipulating court records had made many inconvenient problems disappear entirely. His presence guaranteed that the marriage, however repugnant, would be legally binding and officially recorded. The third key figure was Captain Lucien Dufresne, whose connections to both Confederate military leadership and the underground networks that moved people and goods through war-torn Louisiana made him invaluable to the society's operations. Dufresne had earned his reputation through acts of brutality that shocked even hardened soldiers, and his methods for dealing with potential witnesses or obstacles were legendary among society members. As afternoon faded toward evening, the wedding preparations took on an increasingly ritualistic character that went far beyond traditional marriage customs. The ceremony would be held not in the plantation's elegant main parlor, but in the basement of the mansion, a stone-walled chamber that had been constructed for purposes that Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau had never shared with his descendants. The walls bore symbols carved deep into the stone, patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering candlelight, creating an atmosphere that was more suited to pagan ritual than Christian marriage. Cornelius had insisted on personally overseeing every detail of the preparations, from the arrangement of black candles around the chamber to the positioning of chairs for the society members who would serve as witnesses. His behavior throughout the day had become increasingly manic, as if the approaching ceremony was releasing something that had been carefully contained for decades. He spoke frequently to empty air, carrying on conversations with ancestors who existed only in his fevered imagination, and his eyes had taken on a glassy quality that suggested either madness or the influence of chemical stimulants. Celeste, meanwhile, had spent the day in her room, supposedly preparing for the ceremony but actually making final preparations for her own plan of revenge. The compound she had prepared from the plantation's poisonous plants was ready, carefully measured into doses that would achieve different effects depending on the amount consumed. Some portions were designed to cause immediate death, while others would create symptoms that would appear hours later, allowing her to escape suspicion until it was too late for anyone to stop her. Her wedding dress, a creation of white silk and French lace that had belonged to her grandmother, had been altered to include hidden pockets where she could conceal the small glass vials containing her preparations. To anyone observing her, she appeared to be nothing more than a terrified young woman preparing to submit to circumstances beyond her control. But behind her green eyes lay a calculating intelligence that had inherited all of her grandfather's ruthlessness while retaining the moral clarity that he had long since abandoned. As evening approached and the time for the ceremony drew near, Celeste made one final addition to her preparations. From her mother's jewelry case, she retrieved a small silver locket that had been passed down through the female line of the family for generations. Inside the locket, instead of the usual portrait or lock of hair, she placed a piece of paper containing a single sentence written in her careful handwriting. "The sins of Belmont Plantation end with me." At precisely 8 o'clock, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon and thunder rumbled in the distance like the approaching footsteps of divine judgment, Cornelius knocked on Celeste's door to escort her to what he believed would be the culmination of his family's destiny. When she opened the door and took his arm, her smile was so serene and accepting that he never noticed the slight bulge in her dress where the glass vials rested against her ribs, or the way her free hand seemed to caress something hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Are you ready, my dear?" he asked, his voice trembling with anticipation. "I have never been more ready for anything in my life," Celeste replied, and the truth of that statement was more profound than her grandfather could possibly have imagined. The basement chamber of Belmont Plantation had been transformed into something that seemed to exist outside of both time and decency. Black candles arranged in geometric patterns cast dancing shadows on stone walls that had been carved with symbols that predated Christianity's arrival in Louisiana. The air was thick with incense that burned in brass censers, creating a cloying sweetness that could not quite mask the underlying odors of damp earth and something far more sinister, the lingering scent of death that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. The society members stood in a circle around the makeshift altar, their silver medallions catching the candlelight and reflecting it back in patterns that seemed to move with their own malevolent life. Each man wore formal evening attire, despite the basement setting, as if their expensive clothes could somehow elevate the abomination they were about to witness into something resembling respectability. Dr. Hebert had positioned himself at the altar, a leather-bound book in his hands that bore no resemblance to any traditional religious text. The volume was bound in what appeared to be human skin, its pages yellow with age and covered in script that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. This was the Society's unholy scripture, a collection of rituals and beliefs that they had accumulated over generations of practicing their twisted interpretation of bloodline preservation. As Cornelius led Celeste down the stone steps, the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop perceptibly. Several candles flickered and nearly went out, causing Judge Fontenot to mutter something under his breath about atmospheric disturbances, a phrase that carried particular meaning among society members who believed their rituals could influence natural forces. Celeste moved with the graceful composure of a woman walking to her wedding, but those who looked closely might have noticed that her eyes were constantly moving, cataloguing the positions of each man in the chamber, noting the locations of exits and potential weapons, calculating angles and distances with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. Her grandfather, intoxicated by his own sense of power and purpose, noticed none of these details. The ceremony began with Dr. Hebert reciting passages from the Society's forbidden text, his voice taking on a rhythmic cadence that seemed designed to induce a trance-like state in both participants and witnesses. The words were a mixture of corrupted Latin, archaic French, and phrases in languages that no living person should have known how to speak. As he spoke, the other society members began a low humming that harmonized with his voice, creating a sound that seemed to resonate through the stone walls and into the very foundations of the plantation. Captain Dufresne had positioned himself near the chamber's single entrance, ostensibly to prevent interruption, but actually to ensure that no one present would be able to leave before the ceremony was complete. His hand rested casually on the hilt of a cavalry saber that had seen extensive use during his military service, and his eyes never stopped moving as he watched for any sign of resistance or escape attempt. Judge Fontenot stood ready with the legal documents that would make the union official, his pen poised over papers that had been prepared with the same attention to detail that he brought to all his work for the Society. These documents would not only legitimize the marriage, but would also transfer complete legal control of Celeste's inheritance to her new husband, ensuring that Cornelius would have unrestricted access to the Thibodeau fortune. As the ritual progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Several of the Society members began showing signs of physical distress, sweating profusely despite the cool temperature, breathing heavily as if the air in the chamber had become too thick to draw into their lungs, and swaying slightly as if they were having difficulty maintaining their balance. Dr. Hebert initially dismissed these symptoms as natural responses to the emotional intensity of the ceremony, but as more men began exhibiting similar problems, he started to suspect that something else was affecting them. What none of the Society members realized was that Celeste had spent the afternoon carefully introducing her prepared compounds into various items throughout the chamber. The incense burning in the brass censers had been treated with a mild hallucinogenic agent that would cause disorientation and confusion. The wine that had been provided for the post-ceremony celebration contained a slower-acting poison that would not take full effect until hours after consumption. Even the candles had been treated with substances that would release toxic vapors when burned, creating an atmosphere that was literally poisonous to breathe. But Celeste's masterstroke was still to come. As Dr. Hebert reached the portion of the ceremony where the bride and groom would exchange rings and seal their union with a kiss, she made her move with the timing and precision of a seasoned assassin. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice cutting through the rhythmic chanting with crystalline clarity, "I believe there is something that should be shared with everyone present." The sudden interruption caused an immediate hush to fall over the chamber. Cornelius turned to look at his granddaughter with an expression of surprise that quickly darkened into anger. But before he could speak, Celeste continued with a smile that was both beautiful and terrifying. My dear grandfather has told me so much about the sacred traditions of Les Gardiens du Sang-Pur, and I wanted to honor those traditions by preparing a special communion for everyone present. From the hidden pockets in her wedding dress, she produced a silver tray containing small crystal glasses, each filled with what appeared to be sacramental wine. This vintage comes from grapes grown in the soil of our family cemetery, the secret one where so many inconvenient people have been buried over the years. The effect of her words was immediate and electric. Several society members stepped backward involuntarily, their faces going pale as they realized that their most carefully guarded secret had been discovered. Captain Dufresne's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, but he hesitated, uncertain whether the young woman represented a real threat or was simply making desperate accusations. Cornelius, however, understood immediately that his granddaughter knew far more than she should have been able to discover. His mask of grandfatherly concern fell away completely, revealing the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath the surface. "You foolish child," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "You have no idea what forces you are meddling with." Celeste's smile never wavered as she raised one of the crystal glasses in a mock toast. "Oh, but I do, grandfather. I know exactly what I am meddling with. I know about the murders, the buried bodies, the society's experiments in bloodline purification. I know that you killed my parents when they tried to stop you, and I know that you plan to kill me as soon as this obscene ceremony is complete." The tension in the chamber had become so thick it was almost tangible. Every man present understood that they had reached a moment of absolute crisis. Either they would complete their ritual and eliminate the threat that Celeste represented, or everything they had worked for over generations would be exposed and destroyed. "What I want to know," Celeste continued, still holding the glass aloft, "is which of you gentlemen has the courage to drink first from the fruits of your own evil?" The silence that followed Celeste's challenge stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of candles sputtering and the increasingly labored breathing of the society members who were beginning to feel the full effects of the poisoned atmosphere. In that moment, every person in the chamber understood that they had passed the point of no return. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the Thibodeau family, but the future of Les Gardiens du Sang-Pur itself. Captain Dufresne was the first to act, drawing his saber in one fluid motion and pointing it directly at Celeste's throat. "Enough of these games, child. You will complete the ceremony, and you will forget whatever fantasies you have created about your family's history." But Celeste had been prepared for exactly this response. As the blade moved toward her, she deliberately dropped the crystal glass she had been holding. It shattered on the stone floor, and the wine within began to hiss and smoke as it made contact with the ancient stones, releasing vapors that made everyone present step backward in alarm. "That wine," she said calmly, "was prepared from oleander flowers, foxglove leaves, and several other plants that grow wild in our beautiful Louisiana bayous. The same plants that your society has been using for generations to eliminate inconvenient people. The same compounds that killed my parents when their carriage horses were fed poison-laced grain just before their journey." Dr. Hebert, his medical training allowing him to recognize the implications of what she was describing, moved quickly toward his black bag. But Celeste's voice stopped him with words that froze the blood in his veins. "I wouldn't reach for your instruments just yet, Doctor. You see, every person in this chamber has already been exposed to carefully measured doses of various toxins. The incense you've been breathing contains compounds that affect the nervous system. The wine you sampled during your preparations was treated with substances that are currently working their way through your bloodstream. Even the candles have been burning chemicals that become increasingly dangerous the longer you remain in this chamber." Judge Fontenot, his legal mind immediately grasping the implications, stepped forward with his hands raised in what he hoped would appear to be a peaceful gesture. "Young lady, if you have grievances against your grandfather, there are legal channels through which they can be addressed. There is no need for anyone to be harmed." Celeste's laughter echoed off the stone walls like the sound of breaking glass. "Legal channels? Judge Fontenot, you have spent your entire career ensuring that there are no legal channels capable of addressing the crimes of Les Gardiens du Sang-Pur. How many documents have you falsified? How many death certificates have you signed without question? How many murders have you helped conceal behind your legal manipulations? The judge's face went ashen as he realized that his own criminal activities had been discovered and documented. But before he could respond, Cornelius stepped forward with a fury that seemed to radiate from every pore of his body. "You ungrateful little witch," he snarled, his carefully maintained facade of respectability finally cracking completely. "Do you have any idea what sacrifices I have made to preserve our family's legacy? What I have done to ensure that the Thibodeau name would endure through generations?" "I know exactly what you have done," Celeste replied, her voice carrying a steel that would have impressed any general. "I found the records you kept, grandfather. Every murder carefully documented, every body catalogued and numbered. 317 graves in your secret cemetery, representing 317 people who stood in the way of your ambitions." She reached into another hidden pocket and produced a leather journal, its pages filled with her grandfather's meticulous handwriting. Enslaved people who learned too much about society activities, neighboring planters who asked uncomfortable questions, government officials who couldn't be bribed, members of your own family who threatened to expose your crimes. As she spoke, she began backing toward a section of the chamber wall that appeared to be solid stone, but which she had discovered contained a hidden passage, one of several escape routes that Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau had built into the plantation's design for reasons that now seemed all too clear. "My parents discovered what you were doing, didn't they?" She continued, her voice rising with emotion for the first time. "They found evidence of your embezzlement, your murders, your involvement with this society of monsters. They were going to take me away from Bellamont, weren't they? Away from you and your plans for preserving the pure blood." Cornelius's response was a roar of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber. "They were weak. They lacked the vision to understand what we were building, the strength to do what was necessary. What you were building," Celeste shot back, "was an empire of death and suffering. What you called strength was nothing more than the cowardice of men too weak to face consequences for their actions." Captain Dufresne, recognizing that the situation had spiraled beyond any hope of containment, raised his saber and lunged toward Celeste with the intention of ending her threat permanently. But the young woman had inherited more than just her grandfather's intelligence. She had also acquired his instinct for survival and his willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve her goals. As the blade swept toward her, Celeste triggered the hidden mechanism that opened the secret passage, simultaneously throwing the remaining contents of her silver tray directly into the faces of the advancing society members. The crystal glasses shattered against the stone walls, releasing clouds of toxic vapor that immediately began affecting everyone in the chamber. Dr. Heber screamed as the acidic compounds made contact with his eyes, temporarily blinding him and sending him stumbling into Judge Fontenot. Captain Dufresne's sword strike went wide as his coordination failed. The neurotoxins Celeste had been dispersing finally reaching levels that affected motor function. But Cornelius, driven by a rage that seemed to transcend the effects of any poison, continued pursuing his granddaughter even as she disappeared into the hidden passage. His voice followed her into the darkness, carrying promises of retribution that were all the more terrifying because they came from a man who had proven himself capable of keeping such promises. "You cannot escape what you are," he roared, his words echoing through the stone corridors. "The blood of Les Gardiens flows in your veins. You will become exactly what I am, because it is what our family was always meant to be." Behind him, the basement chamber had become a scene of complete chaos. The toxic compounds Celeste had introduced were now reaching their full potency, and the society members were experiencing effects ranging from hallucinations to complete physical incapacitation. Dr. Hebert, his medical bag forgotten in his agony, was clawing at his face and screaming about visions of the people he had helped murder. Judge Fontenot had collapsed against the altar, his body convulsing as the slower-acting poisons worked their way through his system. But the most disturbing sight was Captain Dufresne, who had somehow maintained enough consciousness to understand what was happening to him. As the toxins affected his nervous system, he began experiencing what appeared to be vivid hallucinations of every person he had killed during his military service and his work for the society. He swung his saber wildly at enemies only he could see, his voice rising in a battle cry that had once struck terror into the hearts of Union soldiers, but now sounded like the wailing of a man descending into madness. Meanwhile, Celeste navigated the hidden passages with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks mapping every tunnel and escape route in the plantation's underground network. These passages, carved from the living rock by enslaved craftsmen whose knowledge of their layout had died with them, connected not just different areas of the mansion, but also led to exits, scattered throughout the plantation grounds. Her destination was not escape, however, but completion of the justice she had planned. The secret chamber where she emerged contained the evidence she had spent months collecting: documents, photographs, and physical proof of the society's crimes stretching back decades. More importantly, it contained the materials needed for the final phase of her revenge. As she worked quickly to prepare the last elements of her plan, she could hear her grandfather's voice getting closer, his pursuit relentless despite the chaos she had left behind in the ceremony chamber. His words, echoing through the stone corridors, revealed the full depth of his madness and obsession. "The marriage will be completed," he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "The bloodline will be preserved. The ancestors demand it." When Cornelius finally located the chamber where Celeste had taken refuge, he found her standing calmly beside a table laden with explosive materials that she had collected from various sources around the plantation. Gunpowder from the gun room, chemicals from the plantation's sugar processing equipment, and combustible materials that would ensure complete destruction of everything in the basement levels of the mansion. "You're too late, grandfather," she said, her voice carrying a finality that made him stop short. "The evidence of your crimes is already on its way to authorities in New Orleans. The letters I prepared weeks ago were delivered this morning by people who have no connection to this plantation and no reason to lie about what they carried." Cornelius stared at his granddaughter with a mixture of admiration and horror. "You planned all of this from the beginning, from the moment I announced the marriage. From the moment I discovered what you did to my parents," she corrected. "Everything since then has been preparation for this moment." The old man's shoulders sagged as he finally understood that his careful plans, developed over months of preparation, had been countered by someone who possessed all of his intelligence and ruthlessness, but none of his moral corruption. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice suddenly sounding every one of his 67 years. "I want you to understand something before this ends," Celeste replied. "You always believed that strength came from the willingness to do evil, that power meant the ability to hurt others without consequences. But real strength comes from the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect the innocent, even when that sacrifice includes your own life." As she spoke, she struck a match and held it over the fuse she had prepared. The flame cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, illuminating both their faces with a flickering light that seemed to reveal the fundamental difference between them, one face showing peace and resolution, the other showing the terror of a man finally facing consequences for his actions. "The bloodline of Les Gardiens du Sang Pur ends here," she said. "With me. And with you." The explosion that destroyed the basement levels of Belmont Plantation on the night of October 13, 1863, was heard as far away as New Orleans, where Union military authorities initially assumed it was related to Confederate sabotage activities. The fire that followed burned for 3 days, consuming not just the mansion, but also the slave quarters, outbuildings, and much of the surrounding grounds. Official reports filed by Union investigators who arrived at the scene described the destruction as the result of an accidental explosion in the plantation's powder magazine, likely caused by Confederate deserters attempting to steal gunpowder and ammunition. This explanation was accepted without question, partly because it fit with known patterns of wartime destruction, and partly because the evidence that might have suggested other causes had been completely obliterated by the fire. What the investigators never learned was that Celeste's carefully planned revenge had succeeded beyond even her expectations. The explosion had indeed killed everyone present in the basement chamber, but the fire that followed had also destroyed the plantation's main house, where she had strategically placed additional incendiary materials to ensure complete destruction of any remaining evidence of the society's activities. More importantly, the letters she had prepared and sent to various authorities had reached their destinations and were already being investigated by federal officials who specialized in tracking Confederate conspiracies. These letters, written with the precision of someone who understood exactly what evidence would be needed to secure convictions, provided detailed information about Les Gardiens du Sang Pur's membership, activities, and hidden assets throughout Louisiana. In the weeks following the Belmont fire, mysterious accidents began befalling prominent plantation owners throughout southern Louisiana. Judge Armand Fontenot was found dead in his New Orleans office, apparently having consumed poisoned wine that investigators were never able to trace to any source. Dr. Alphonse Hébert disappeared entirely. His carriage found abandoned on a lonely road with signs of a violent struggle, but no trace of the physician himself. Captain Lucien Dufresne was discovered in his military quarters, killed by his own sword in what appeared to be either suicide or an extremely personal act of revenge. Federal authorities, following leads provided in Celeste's letters, began investigating other society members with a thoroughness that revealed crimes spanning decades. Bank records were seized, property deeds were examined, and cemetery plots were excavated. What they found confirmed the most disturbing allegations in the anonymous correspondence: evidence of systematic murder, fraud, and conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Louisiana's antebellum society. By the end of 1864, Les Gardiens du Sang-Pur had been effectively destroyed as an organization. Some members fled to Mexico or Europe, others were arrested and tried for various crimes, and still others simply disappeared. Whether through suicide, murder by fellow conspirators, or other means was never determined. The society's accumulated wealth, seized by federal authorities, was used to establish schools and hospitals for freed slaves throughout Louisiana. The Belmont plantation itself was never rebuilt. The land was eventually sold to pay debts and taxes, then subdivided among several small farmers who knew nothing of its history. Local residents, however, continued to avoid the area where the mansion had stood, claiming that the ground itself seemed cursed. Strange sounds were reported on quiet nights, voices speaking in archaic French, the sound of carriages on roads that no longer existed, and most disturbing of all, what sounded like a young woman singing lullabies in a language that no one could identify. As decades passed, the true story of what happened at Belmont became increasingly obscured by folklore and deliberate efforts to conceal uncomfortable truths. The families of society members who had escaped prosecution worked diligently to erase any mention of Les Gardiens du Sang-Pur from historical records, bribing archivists, destroying documents, and ensuring that official histories of antebellum Louisiana focused on more acceptable aspects of plantation life. But rumors persisted among Louisiana's African-American communities, passed down through generations of families whose ancestors had witnessed or heard about the society's activities. These stories, dismissed by white historians as superstition or exaggeration, preserved details about the secret cemetery, the midnight ceremonies, and the young woman who had brought justice to Belmont Plantation at the cost of her own life. In 1889, 26 years after the fire, the Vermilion Parish Courthouse experienced a mysterious blaze that destroyed most of the official records related to antebellum plantation ownership and legal proceedings. Investigators found evidence that the fire had been deliberately set, but the perpetrator was never identified. Among the documents that survived, however, was a single page from a marriage register dated October 13, 1863, bearing the names Cornelius Thibodeau and Celeste Marie Thibodeau, with a notation in the margin that simply read, "Ceremony interrupted, participants deceased." Modern historians who have studied the scattered evidence of Les Gardiens du Sang-Pur generally dismiss the more extreme allegations as wartime propaganda or post-war embellishment of relatively minor scandals. They point out that many of the claims attributed to the society would have been impossible to conceal from authorities, and that the scale of the alleged conspiracy would have required cooperation from hundreds of people across multiple parishes. But occasionally, researchers working in Louisiana archives encounter documents that suggest a more disturbing truth. Property deeds that show the same families controlling vast tracts of land through marriages that violated both law and custom. Medical records describing genetic abnormalities consistent with prolonged inbreeding. Cemetery plots that contain far more graves than official death records would suggest. And most intriguingly, financial records showing regular payments from plantation families to individuals whose services are never clearly described, but whose activities seem to have involved traveling throughout Louisiana and conducting business that required absolute secrecy. In 1963, exactly 100 years after the Belmont fire, construction workers preparing to build a shopping center on part of the former plantation grounds made a discovery that briefly reignited interest in the site's history. While excavating for foundations, they uncovered what appeared to be a mass grave containing the remains of dozens of individuals, many showing signs of violent death. The discovery was quickly covered up by local authorities, who claimed that the remains were probably Union soldiers killed during an unknown Civil War skirmish. But several of the construction workers reported finding artifacts among the remains that didn't match military equipment from the 1860s, items that appeared to be much older, including silver medallions bearing symbols that no one could identify and documents written in languages that local scholars couldn't translate. These artifacts were confiscated by authorities and have never been made available for independent examination. Today, the area where Belmont Plantation once stood is occupied by a suburban development whose residents occasionally report strange phenomena. Voices heard at night, the smell of burning wood when no fires are lit, and the sound of horses and carriages on streets where no such vehicles travel. Most residents dismiss these reports as imagination or the effects of living in an area with such a violent history. But every October 13th, local police receive calls about unusual activities in the area. Lights seen moving through empty houses, the sound of music and laughter coming from locations where no parties are taking place, and most disturbing of all, reports of a young woman in a white dress who appears briefly in windows or doorways before vanishing when observers look more closely. The truth about what happened at Belmont Plantation on that October night in 1863 may never be fully known. The evidence has been destroyed, the witnesses are long dead, and the official records have been carefully sanitized to remove any reference to the more disturbing aspects of the story. But the legacy of Celeste Marie Thibodeau's courage continues to inspire those who learn her story. Proof that even in the darkest circumstances, one person's willingness to sacrifice everything for justice can triumph over generations of evil. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the Louisiana bayous? Leave your comment below and tell us about any similar legends from your own area. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of history holds many secrets, and we'll continue to uncover them together. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chapter in America's hidden past.